Korach and his group, they contested Moshe, and they claimed that it was not Hashem's choice, but it was his choice, that he chose Aaron to be the Kohen Gadol and his younger cousin to be the Nasi, the prince of the family. He said it will be proven through the test of fire. You should take fire pans, and they should take ketores and burn it, the ketores on the fire pan. And there's only going to be one survivor. I always say, even if a person believes in the Yud Gimel Ikra Emunah, you believe in the 13 tenets of Jewish belief, but since many of them are belief based on belief, but we never saw the reality, we relate to it, although we don't question it. Therefore, when we're challenged, it's not so simple to be able to withstand the challenge. I'll give you the example. The Ramban writes in Torah Odom that one moment of Gehenna is more painful. Of course, the pain we're speaking about is in the spiritual realm. We have no idea, but to equate it to physical pain, one moment, 1 nanosecond of Gehenna is more painful than all Yisuri Eov, all the trials and tribulations of Eov. That's how painful Gehenna is. And the Mishnah tells the Pirkei Avos that if you do one mitzvah, schar b'yal maleka, there's not enough reward in the physical realm to reward you for one mitzvah. So if you do multiple mitzvahs, definitely it's something not fathomable. And if you do one mitzvah, which is the equivalent of all the mitzvahs, one word of Torah, we say Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, is the equivalent of 613 mitzvahs. But yet we slacken off. If a person was offered a deal, a multi-billion-dollar deal, would you pass on it for anything, for any reason? Definitely not. But yet, one mitzvah, even if it's a single mitzvah, and if you have a mitzvah which is the equivalent to all 613, yet we say, it's not for now, it's for later, or not even for later. But if we believe with absolute faith, as the Aning Mammon says, we believe with absolute faith that there is schar v'onish, there's reward and punishment, because God knows every nuance of our behavior and our thought, but yet we pass on the mitzvah and we cross lines that we shouldn't cross. What's the reason? But if we believe it without question, why do we transgress the times and we're not sufficiently motivated to do the mitzvah? We'll put it on the back burner. How do we understand it? I asked the question. We asked the question last week. The Torah juxtaposes the parsha of the Nazir to the portion of the Sota. What relevance does Nazir have to do with Sota? So Rashi cites the Gemara. Gemara says in Nazir, because if you see the consequence of adultery, and you see how the ritual of the Sota, how she's affected, how every artery in her body bursts, and literally she's dismembered due to drinking, taking the oath and drinking the water with the rid of Sota obliterated in it, you'll swear off wine forever. So if you see Sota Kukula, you see the Sota in her state, where it's evident and confirmed that she committed adultery, and the consequence of that, you should enter into a state of Nazarethhood. Because what brought about that adulterous act? It started with the social drink, with the wine. They went out, they had a glass of wine, one thing led to another, ultimately ended with adultery. Therefore, you should enter into a state of Nazarethhood, which you're not permitted to drink wine, and as a result of that, you'll ward off this type of situation. It'll leave an indelible impression on your mind, on your emotion, because you're actually actualizing that situation. You're keeping more than arm's length away from wine. So that's the question. What do you have to become a Nazir? Take a shvua, take an oath, and swear, I will not drink wine, I will not eat grapes, any grape derivative, I swear it off. And a shvua oath is something very serious. You will not violate an oath. Or make a neder. Take a vow, konim, anovim, olai. Grapes, grape derivatives are off limits to me. Finished. If that is all we're trying to accomplish. What does he have to enter into the state of Naziritehood? Where he's not permitted to contaminate himself to the dead. He's not permitted to, even his 7 closest relatives, he's not permitted to cut his hair. And the Ramban writes that when the Nazir finishes, it's 30 days, which is the minimum amount of time of Nazirus, he has to bring a chatos. What does he have to bring a chatos? A sin offering. The Ramban asks, if the Nazir is considered kadosh, holy, there's no reason to bring a sin offering. So he writes, the Ramban, that because he entered into a realm of such holiness, that he's returning to the mundane life, that's the claim against him. He's bringing a chatos for not remaining in that exalted spiritual state. That's the Ramban. But what do you have to be elevated and enter into a new state of holiness to be able to learn this lesson well? If the holy is wine, take a shvua, take an oath, make a vow. So what's the answer? 2 things. I understand it's wrong. I see its consequences. But to be able to internalize something, you have to have a certain capacity to be able to be impacted and affected by something. For instance, a person can have an ingenious mind, and I can present something which is irrefutable. But if the person lives a different lifestyle, well, let's say, I understand what you're saying. I'm convinced, but it's because the essence of the person, his inclination is not in that direction. So his reality of life, we live life as reality. We don't live life in the abstract. The only time something affects our lives, if it has relevance to our reality of life, which is our physicality. Something which is so removed from us, we're not impacted. We may understand, but it does not affect our lives. There's a famous word from Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. The furthest distance in existence is between the mind, the brain, and the heart. Although proximity-wise, it's very close. But in reality, there's no further distance. What we understand, it's so far from our heart. The heart is the emotion, is the feeling. To be able to internalize it, there's nothing further than from the brain to the heart. What does that mean? It means exactly what we're saying. If a person will live a life of kedusha, of holiness, and you're conditioned, and you've spiritualized your physicality, then you have a capacity to absorb and appreciate what that is. The effect, the ramifications, the negative of whatever that is, or the positive value of whatever that is. But if you live a life of physicality, the example is a person, God forbid, is a drug addict. And after he has his fix, he looks himself and he sees what it's done to his life, and he understands what it's done. He's read all the information of the negativity of taking drugs. The moment he starts craving, all that means nothing. Unless he's weaned and he gets that foreign substance out of his system, when he craves, it's around what he read, what he understands. He's in his own mindset, and he's going to cross that line unless somehow he's restrained. That's the reality. Every one of us, as a result of the chet of Adam Rishon, that he had imbibed or ingested the evil of that tree of knowledge, our natural inclination is what? Is physicality. Is in a direction which is the antithesis of what is ultimately spiritual. That's every one of us. Unless we condition our bodies, our minds, through the mitzvahs which Hashem gave us, that is the mentoring to give us the senses, and that activates our spiritual senses. Then we sense the negative of the Avera, and we sense the positive of the mitzvah. Therefore, you have to enter into a realm of kedusha that you're not even permitted to the 7 closest relatives to contaminate. That's the Nazir. He's equivalent to a Kohen Gadol. He's not permitted to cut his hair. Only in that state of mind of Kedusha does the person have the capacity to internalize the reality of the consequences of drinking wine and appreciate what adultery is. That it's like putting your hand into fire. No rational person, regardless what's in that fire, the value, if you understand you put your hand in the fire, you're going to lose your hand, you're not putting your hand in the fire. If a person would see the reality of sin to that degree, you're not going to cross that line under any circumstance. That's why he has to be a Nazir, and taking a shua or making a neder is not sufficient to be able to internalize that lesson. That's the understanding. Gehenna, nobody was ever in Gehenna. We know what incarceration means. We know what penalty means. Paying a penalty, which is very costly penalty, a fine. We know what it means to be disgraced in the eyes of our peers. Embarrassment. We know that. It's very simple to internalize. That's reality. Any decent human being doesn't want to go to prison, doesn't want his freedom to be taken away from him, or he doesn't want to be shamed because he understands what shame is, because that's equivalent of pain. But the spiritual realm, which nobody's ever been there, although we talk about it, since it's abstract, it's removed from us, unless you reach a certain level of holiness, only then do you have relevance to be able to appreciate what that is. There's a famous story I always tell over Moshe Feinstein, that years ago there was a wedding hall on the Lower East Side. It was called Broadway Central. All weddings were there, and a car ride from Rav Moshe's yeshiva to there was maybe a 10-minute ride. And many people wanted Rav Moshe Feinstein to officiate at the wedding. It's a big honor, leading Torah sage in America. And because he was such a special person, even a person who hardly knew him, he would agree. And he'd take out time of his day towards early evening. He'd go to the wedding, but he'd only stay for the chuppah. And right after the chuppah, the person who brought them there would bring him back to where he came from, back to the yeshiva. And very often, as we know today, that after the chuppah, at weddings, they daven Mariv. Between the chuppah and before the meal starts. The meal is served. So the person brings Rav Moshe Feinstein, he checks his coat in the check room, and he comes out afterwards, the davening Mariv. So the person who had brought him says to Rav Moshe Feinstein, let's go to the check room, get the coat, so we should be able to leave, because the one who's driving wants to get back to the wedding. So Rav Moshe Feinstein says, but there's a halacha that when a person is saying the Shmon Esrei, the Amida, you're not permitted to walk in front of him. And if they're saying the Shmon Esrei, I can't walk in front of them under any circumstance. The person says, but maybe this one time you'll do it. He's in a rush to take him back because he wants to get back to the wedding. And Rav Moshe says, but the halacha is you're not permitted to walk in front of a person who's saying the Amida. So he says, and if you do walk, is it the end of the world? So Rav Moshe Feinstein says to him, if you'd have a brick wall here, and there's something on the other side of the wall, are you going to tell me to walk through a brick wall? You can't walk through the wall. If the halacha is that you're not permitted to walk in front of a person saying the Amida, under no circumstance, unless it meets halacha criteria, you're not permitted to do it. Finished. Regardless of how pressing you want to get back to the wedding. That was Rav Moshe Feinstein, because he lived every moment of his life fully invested in Torah and Kedusha. So therefore, that was his reality. But if that's not your reality, we'll do it just this one time. I want to get back. I'm in a rush. I have my reason. That's the concept. Okay? We find that Miriam Hanaviyah, she was Moshe and Aaron's sister. She had spoken out of turn about Moshe Rabbeinu. She became a leper for speaking Lashon Hara. And the lesson was learned well because it was public knowledge. For a week, they did not travel. And it was obvious why. That as holy as she is, look the way Hashem, if you cross the line, nobody is above the law, she's punished. But yet, soon afterwards, the Meraglim, they go and they bring back ominous reports about Eretz Yisrael. So Rashi over there cites the Chazal. Why is the story of the Meraglim juxtaposed to the story of of Miriam to teach us, Rishoim halolu ro, these evil persons saw what happened to Miriam, they did not learn a lesson. So the question is, how could you not learn a lesson? If Miriam was nearly perfect, and she's judged so severely for speaking Lashon Hara, so when you speak against God, if God said it's a land of Zovas Cholim Dvosh, how could you say that it's Eretz Ochel Tzlom Yoshvel? It's a land that devours its inhabitants. We can't survive it. You're slandering God. So what's the answer? Why did they learn? They were these are princes, leaders of tribes, very intelligent people. What's the answer? Rishoim halolu ro halolu kubusa. Because they were Rishoim. Because they were evil. The evil person, you could see it, but it doesn't impact on you. They don't have the capacity to internalize what happened to Miriam. They're not touched by it. And if you're not touched and you have your own agenda, you see it through your own lens. You don't see it through an appropriate lens. That's the understanding. What I'm telling you now is an introduction to something I'm going to speak about right now. When the state of Israel was founded, we had a standing army. So the question is, who's going to be eligible for conscription, who not? So Chazon Ish says, and Chazon Ish was the leading Torah sage in Eretz Yisrael, and his word was the first and final word. And the religious community, the Torah community, accepted his word as that's the final word. And Ben Gurion understood that there's no way he's able to change that position unless the Chazon Ish would be agreeable to it. So what happened? He figured he'd go speak to the Chazon Ish, because if he convinced the Chazon Ish that yeshiva students should be drafted into the army, no problem. Because their position is based on the Chazon Ish. He's the Torah leader. Give you just some information, which is just side information. So the Chazon Ish, this is like in 1949. He sends the Ben Gurion sends his person, and he pulls up. He drives in those 1949 or 48. Bnei Brak was like sand dunes. He pulls up in this black, like you used to watch, the Al Capone, the cars, what they looked like, in Chicago in those years. This black sedan, and he gets out. This head of his right-hand man gets out, knocks on the Chazon Ish's door. He comes in. This man doesn't even weigh 100 pounds. And this man in his early 70s, and he tells him who he is. And he says, I've come to set an appointment for the Prime Minister of Israel, Ben Gurion. When could he come? So he says to this person, he says, every Jew is welcome in my house 24 hours a day. You just have to knock on the door, come in, even the Prime Minister of Israel. This man was not a religious Jew, he was a secular Jew. Not only was he a secular Jew, he was a person who cannot tolerate the religion, and he becomes livid. Here I'm telling you, the Prime Minister of Israel wants to come to your home for an appointment. You tell me that every Jew's welcome in your house. Don't you realize we're talking about the Prime Minister of Israel? But he didn't say a word. He goes back to Ben Gurion, and he tells Ben Gurion, and he says to Ben Gurion, "Do you hear the arrogance of this little nobody? This and this and this." So Ben Gurion says, "You don't understand. That's the type of man I respect. He's intimidated by nobody, even by the Prime Minister of Israel." That was Ben Gurion's response to his chief of staff. Ben Gurion, he comes to the Chazon Ish. Ben Gurion was a Bundist. He didn't believe in the authenticity of Torah at all, but he knew Tanakh very well, and he felt, knowing Tanakh, he's a great expert on Judaism. But he didn't realize the Chazon Ish, there was nothing the Chazon Ish did not know, not only about Tanakh, about the Talmud, about the Mishnah, besides being beyond genius, being one of a kind of a person. Comes in, he begins the conversation. He's like amazed. He's never met such a person in his life, Ben Gurion. And after everything's said and done, Ben Gurion says, I hear what you're saying, but I don't disagree. So how do you know you're right? Maybe I'm right. So the Chazon Ish opens up his shirt and he points to his heart and he says to Ben Gurion, Libi Omer Kach. My heart tells me I'm right. That's the basis. After all I know, ultimately, my heart tells me that this is a correct position. And Ben Gurion accepted it. My heart tells, why does his heart tell him so? And somebody's heart doesn't say so. Ben Gurion had a different heart. Ben Gurion, who invested every moment of his life, Chazon Ish, every moment of his life, in Torah study, in Kedusha, in serving Hashem, and every day was an upgrade to another level, he had a different capacity. He had a different level of absorption to understand things which you can't understand unless you're at that point. So that's what we're talking about. So if you live as a physical human being, even as an observant Jew, but unless your life is invested fully at that very special level, that sixth sense, which are your spiritual nerve endings, are not able to be touched. Therefore, you don't fully internalize certain things. Therefore, we cross lines and we're not motivated sufficiently, although we know Schai Leko, and we know that whatever we know, but to be able to be touched to such a degree, it's not the same. I'll give you an example. That if you experience a Rosh Hashanah as you should experience it, and as you do, the way you relate to serving Hashem during this period of time is different than throughout the year. Question is why? Because during this time, we are more careful, and the mindset is a different mindset. We sense the day of judgment coming. The Sereshimei Tshuva. We've done Tshuva. We've experienced a day, 2 days of what? Of the shofar and whatever we say. Because we're touched differently, therefore we have a different capacity for internalization. Once Yom Kippur is over, it's already, you're going south. The capacity is minimized. You don't have it any longer. Okay? That's the introduction to what we're going to talk about this moment. There's an opinion that the people of the men of Klal Yisrael, they suspected Moshe Rabbeinu that he had his eye on their wives. And therefore, men said, they forewarned their wives, we don't want you to go near Moshe Rabbeinu. It's called, that's the forewarning. That's called kinui. There's kinui in the stira. The husband forewarns the wife, and then God forbid, if she defies his warning, she secludes herself with that person, she becomes a sota. She becomes the suspected adulteress. Now, how's it possible? Moshe Rabbeinu, the man radiates Kedusha. The man split the sea. A man of that dimension. And Hashem openly communicates with him. With such a man, God forbid, have his eye on anybody's wife. And he's separated from his own wife. How's it possible? That's the question. Alan, is that the question?
Okay, yes.
Okay, good. So the morale of Korach says like this. What's the essence of every human being? Your soul, your neshama. Okay? That's the most intimate part of every one of us. We don't even understand what our neshama is. But our neshama touches us in many ways that we don't even understand that it's emanating from our neshama. Chazal tell us that Moshe Rabbeinu was shokol keneged Yisrael. That Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama was the equivalent of all Klal Yisrael. That means Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama was attached. Every Jew's soul was attached to Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama. You understand? As a result of that, every woman's soul was attached to Moshe Rabbeinu's soul. So the men didn't understand where this was coming about. They knew Moshe had some relevance to their wives. The relevance was the neshama, the attachment of the soul. So the way it manifested itself, they didn't know what it was all about. As a result of that, they said, you know something, just stay away from Moshe Rabbeinu. That's how the Maharal of Prague explains it. And he told them that when you take the fire pans, that's the test of fire, there's only be one survivor. So if you have a 250 to 1 chance that you're going to survive, that you're not going to survive, which person in his right mind is going to go there? But why did Moshe Rabbeinu choose the Ketores? So Rashi says, Pasuk Vav, Ma ro lomalem kach. Why did he choose to tell them this? To take the fire pans with ketores? Omalan bedarke goyim. Among the protocols, the modes of worship among non-Jews, yesh nimusim harbe v'komrim harbe. The many nimusim, many modes of behavior, and the many priests. They have all kinds of priests. V'kulam enkum miskapsin b'isefod. And they don't gather in one location, meaning they're not all on the same page. One person worships the sun, the moon, the power, the god of fertility, the god of wheat, whatever it may be. We Jews, we only have one God. There's nothing exists outside of him. Oro nechod, Torah achas, one ark, one Torah, Mizbeach echod, the Kohen Gadol echod. There's only one high priest. You may think you're all qualified, but there's only one person who represents Klal Yisrael in terms of being connected to God, officiating. And you 250 people believe and you want, because you feel you qualified to be the high priest. Moshe says, look, I would also like to be the high priest. Why? But it's not reality. I'd like to fly, but I'm not a bird. So you don't fly. I will give you a service which is more beloved than anything else to Hashem. Ktores, the incense, is the most beloved avoda for Hashem. But you realize, as much as it's beloved to Hashem, but it has a very negative side, because if you're not qualified to be there, it's literally will take your life. Shebo nisru nodva avihu, as you saw nodva avihu, why did they die? Because it says they brought Eish Zorah. They had brought this alien fire. They brought the Torahs, which they were not permitted to bring. Lefichach hisra b'hem, and that's why he used that full warning, understanding they should appreciate where they're going. And the one who's qualified, because he already has been chosen by Hashem, he's going to be the lone survivor. He says, I'm forewarning you. You're walking in an area where you have a 250 to 1 chance you're not going to make it. Only the one who's chosen by Hashem, he will come out, and the rest of you are all going into the oblivion. You're all going to die. So why did he choose Ketores? You know why? Because everyone saw Nadav Avihu, the most special Jews in Klal Yisrael. They were the upcoming leaders. But because they crossed that one line with Ketores, they were burned to death. A fire came down from heaven, from Shoraim, and they lost their lives. Because they saw it in real time, the consequence of getting involved in this service, and you're not qualified, you're not going to survive. So it's not just abstract. You eat on Yom Kippur, one's liable for spiritual excision. We're not talking about this. Is real time. And being real time, he was hoping this will be definitely will convince him without a question to walk away. But they were so seduced by Korach, and he brought him to such a frenzy, they crossed that line. And as we'll see soon, they all died because of this. It's very interesting. I just want to bring out a point. Who was buried in the Mars Machpelah? After Yaakov Avinu passed away, it says that he instructed his children how he should be transported to Canaan, and he gave the order to Yosef, and I want to be buried in the grave where Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, they're buried, and because it was purchased and so on and so forth. And when he bought the birthright from Esav, he purchased the right to be buried there. Okay? Now, all of a sudden, Yaakov is being brought, his remains are being brought to Canaan. His children are about to bury him. All the ministers of Egypt they're all accompanying him there to be buried, to be determined. Who shows up at the funeral? Esav. And Esav says, you buried Leah here. I have the right. This is my burial plot. You have no right to bury your father there. And they start bickering. They start fighting. And Esav's there with his people. And Yaakov's family's there. And they have a standstill. What do? Chushim was the only son of Dun. Dun had one son. His name was Chushim. Chushim was a deaf mute. He's watching this, and he sees his grandfather lying in disgrace, Yaakov, and this ogre, Esau, evil man, is disgracing the person who's the ultimate holiness. He cannot tolerate. What does he do? He takes a club, and he whacks off Esau's head. He kills Esau. This is the story where Esau's head rolled into the Marzak Pela. He killed Esau. And that's when Rivka had said, I will lose both of you on the same day. This is what she was talking about. That the day of interment of Yaakov, Esau was killed on that same day. So the question, Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, in his Navaleh on Chumash, it's been translated into English, asks, why was Chushim ben done? Why did he appreciate that his grandfather's lying in disgrace more than the rest of them? This is a grandson. We're talking about the children themselves. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, they were all there. Yehuda could have done it easily. Why was Chushim the only one who related to understanding my grandfather's lying in disgrace and this evil man is bringing about this disgrace? And he couldn't tolerate it. They all should have reacted the same way. So he says something phenomenal. He says, all of them, they got involved in the heat of the discussion. You say yes, I say no, and we lose focus that Yaakov is lying in disgrace, because we're all involved in justifying and securing why we have a right to be there. Chushim ben Dun was a deaf mute. See, he's not involved in the discussion. See, he's standing as an innocent bystander, and he's an observer. And what does he see? All he sees is his grandfather lying in disgrace. So because he was able to fully appreciate that level of disgrace, because he had no distraction, that's the reason why he whacked off Esav's head. He was the one who took action, took initiative to kill Esau for that reason. But when you get involved, you lose sight of it. Korach, as it says, he wined and dined these people before he launched his mutiny against Moshe Rabbeinu, the wealthiest man. He worked these people into a frenzy. So even though he tells them, no, the Baviu, they died with the Torah in real time, they saw it. But when you're involved in the frenzy, nepotism, Moshe, you took it, it's not right. You don't fully appreciate it. Even though it's in real time, you don't fully appreciate it. It's like there was a seduction here. And as a result of that, they all perished. So Moshe Rabbeinu presented something which is real time. It brings about death. Despite that, they chose to go the other way because they were so seduced by Korach that they lost sight of the reality, and therefore they all perished. From the very beginning. They originally informed the Moshe Rabbeinu that he killed the Egyptian, he had to flee from Egypt. And when he came back, Moshe continuously, and this was the end of the story of Doesn't That Be Wrong. And it doesn't be as bad as they were bad people, very bad people. Moshe Rabbeinu was trying to reason with them because they were key to this mutiny. So over here it says Yud Beis, Pasuk Yud Beis. V'yishlach Moshe likro ledoson v'la'avirim b'nei Elo v'yomer lo naleh. They said, he called them, and he said, we're not coming up. So Rashi says, why did he call them? Mikan she machzikim machlokas. If there's any way you could diffuse a machlokas, you do it. And Moshe Rabbeinu was the leader. And these underlings have the chutzpah to try to undermine and destroy Klal Yisrael. But you know something? If you could somehow make peace and diffuse it, you do it. He wanted to bring him back with peaceful words. But what? They rejected his peace offer. And look what he said. Hamat, you took us out of a land of milk and honey. You hear this? Lamisedu b'midbar. to die in the desert. I'm the story. And there's no way you're going to lord over us. You know what's going on here? They're referring to Egypt, that when Moshe took him out of Egypt, he took him out of land of milk and honey. I mean, here we're talking about Ve'imor Chayim. We eat morah to commemorate how they embittered our lives, how they killed us, how they threw our male children to drown them, so on and so forth. And they're saying, you know what you did? You took us out of land of milk and honey. And what you took us out of, God forbid, out of Auschwitz, out of the worst concentration camps, to bring us where? And you put us in the yeshiva. Where are they coming from, these guys? I mean, how could they even refer to Egypt as a land of milk and honey? This is the confirmation of what kind of bad guys these guys were. Why initially were they able to inform Moshe Rabbeinu? So Rashi and Mara says, when Moshe came back, what did Hashem say to Moshe? Mesu ho'anoshim elu. The people who informed on you, they died. So the Gemara asks, in the Dorim, I'm quoting the Gemara, the Dorim, not Sanhedrin. Mara says in the Dorim that from here we learn that Odi Choshev Kemes, that since they had very serious financial reversals, they became poor. So the connections to the upper echelons of government they no longer had, but initially they were wealthy. The slave class, there was a wealthy class. They lost everything. And because of that, Hashem says to Moshe, now it's time to go back. Because their wings have been clipped. Okay? They have limited access. They no longer have access to that. But initially, what were they? They were wealthy. They lived like wealthy people within the slave class. They didn't have the responsibilities of other slaves because they had those relationships within the government. So let me ask you, you live in a person, God forbid, is a capo in the concentration camp. He himself, he's given a residence, food, clothing, and he goes and he tortures his brothers. What kind of human being is he? He's a capo. These people, doesn't Aviram, because of the wealthy class, they didn't relate that the brothers are being killed and tortured and enslaved to such a degree. So to them, when Moshe took them out of Egypt, he says, he took us out of land that flows with milk and honey. They did not see beyond themselves. Could you imagine what this is? How self-absorbed they were themselves that they did not relate whatsoever to the plight of their fellow brothers. It's unbelievable. So to them, what did Moshe deny them? Because now what happened was, as a result of the Chet HaMarav, why doesn't Viram agree to leave Egypt? Because they left with tremendous wealth, and they figured when they get to Canaan, their glory is going to be restored because now they're wealthy. And now they're going to flex their muscle and they're going to dominate the Jewish people. That's what they believed. Now that the decree was given that anybody above the age of 20 is going to perish in the Midbar, Moshe, what happened? Everything goes dark. All their aspirations and dreams of being returned to that original arrogance and pompousness and control goes out the window. So what did Moshe do? You took us out of land of milk and honey, because what did they remember from Egypt? They were in the wealthy class. They didn't relate to their fellow Jews, what they were experiencing. And now you shut the door in our faces. There's no way. Even if you'll gouge out our eyes, we're not coming. We're not listening. And they began blaspheming Moshe and Hashem, and that's when the earth opened its mouth and they were all swallowed up.